So today we're going to be covering one of the first books that discusses how to move from the striking distance into grappling scenarios. Hi guys, my name is Joe and welcome to Fighting Words, the martial arts library. And on this channel I review martial arts books and discuss other martial arts related subjects. The subject of today's review is Jeet Kune Do, Entering to Trapping to Grappling. The author is Larry Hartsell, and it was published in 1984. Now, I would like to note that although Larry Hartsell is the only credited author, Tim Tackett has said over the years that he also took part in the writing of this book. He is one of the models that's included here. Those of you who are familiar with the 80s and 90s Jeet Kune Do community will note a lot of familiar names in the models that are being used. In addition to Tackett, we're also getting Paul Vunak, Cass Magda, and Chris Kent of note. This is actually a viewer request. This was requested by Thomas Macaluso. As I mentioned, this book is one of the first books to discuss how to move from striking, punching, and kicking into a grappling scenario. The intro is done by Dan Inosanto, who discusses Jeet Kune Do as more of an experience rather than a style, and forwards this idea that you have to experience boxing, and you have to experience wrestling, you have to experience judo in order to find the things that work for you, and that is part of the core of the Jeet Kune Do experience, as opposed to here's a list of things that we're going to do in class, and that makes it Jeet Kune Do. Chapter 1 starts off with discussing the idea of ranges. So, as presented here, we get kicking range, punching range, trapping range, and grappling range. The one that might be the least familiar to people would be trapping range, and that's the idea that you are too close to throw a good linear punching combination, but you're not quite far enough to begin to go for things like hip throws. It's called trapping range because we're using a series of skills called traps, which basically involve tying up the opponent's limbs in order to prevent their offense and create an opportunity for your own offense. Each of those ranges gets basically a single paragraph, but we also get Mr. Hartsell talking more in depth about how universal the idea of grappling is, and also the utility of grappling, pointing out that, for instance, if you need to restrain someone, you're not going to be able to punch them in the face to do that. It's better to just grab them and put them on the ground. Chapter 2 goes over stance and footwork. The stance that's utilized here is what is referred to as the Baizhong stance, used pretty much throughout Jeet Kune Do. The footwork, he says that there are several different kinds of footwork, but he's only covering the kinds that are applicable to the subject at hand. So in that sense, a lot of the footwork is based primarily on advancing so you can get into range from a distance. And then when you clinch, then you have things like circling footwork and replacement steps so that you get a better angle for things like throws. Chapter 3 gets us into the trapping set of skills. And Mr. Hartsell presents a number of different traps here. We begin with showing the different reference points, in other words, high outside, low outside, high inside, etc. And then we move from basic to compound trapping. So basic trapping would be, using one trapping technique like a pak sao or a lop sao, in other words, a slapping hand or a pulling hand, in order to, again, take the opponent's limbs out of a good offensive position and also create an opening for your own offense. Compound trapping would be throwing more than one trap at a time at the opponent, usually based off of their reaction. In other words, You go for a pak sao and a punch, and they defend, so then you turn that into a lop sao and another punch. The chapter covers a lot of different trap and hit sequences. I will note that nearly all of the trapping sequences come out of what is called a high outside reference, which is shown here. So that's your outside forearm of your lead arm contacting the outside forearm of their lead arm. There are two low reference points toward the end of the chapter. One is from the lead hand, one is from the rear hand. Now, with that foundation set in, chapter 4 is where we actually get into the meat of the book, the entering to trapping to grappling. Again, in reference to the previous chapter, a lot of these entries happen to come off of a high lead hand. So faking a finger jab, so the guy raises his arm to block yours and extends it out, which puts him in a perfect position for trapping. There are some lower line trapping techniques included here as well. Most of the follow-ups include things like throws, chokes, and locks. Some of the locks involve both participants standing or the trapper standing. Some of them involve both people on the ground. And again, this came out in 1984. The idea of going to the ground to finish things off was sort of unusual outside of, judo and traditional jiu-jitsu circles back then as far as publication history goes. It's easy to see during these sequences that there was sort of a blend of grappling methods. There's clearly the catch wrestling influence a little bit, judo, traditional jiu-jitsu. There's also some kali being shown in there. So chapter 5, we sort of continue this trend, but we look at it from a defensive perspective. So this is trapping and grappling defensively used against striking attacks, punches and kicks. And the methods of this defense vary. Sometimes they include trapping. Sometimes it's more of a boxing style defense where you execute a bob and weave in order to get into a clinch. Sometimes you're doing things like elbow destructions like you would find in the Filipino martial arts, where the opponent throws out a strike and you defend it by smashing it with your elbow. And that's your entry into the clinching scenario, and finishing with throws and takedowns and, again, locks. I have to say, one of my criticisms of this section, I understand that they're demos, but there are sequences here that pretty much rely on your opponent to freeze in place with their arm extended. There's one sequence, for instance, where he's actually switching grips, while the guy leaves his arm out there. After a jab, it's not going to happen, So I do like the bob and weave sequences here, but again, there's too much of actually what Bruce Lee would have criticized, which he referred to as dissecting the corpse, where, the attacker freezes in place while the defender, executes several moves at once. Finally, chapter 6 gets into different tie-ups. It talks about using things like trapping and boxing to get into different tie-up positions. They use what I would refer to as high ties, so like collar and bicep ties, as opposed to things like body lock ties. From here, again, we get grappling techniques. There's a number of standing chokes, for instance. There are also some throws and takedowns. Again, for a critical point, sometimes Uke, the demo dummy, has what I would consider sort of a dubious tie-up. This might be just a function of, when the picture was taken, but we've got a collar tie and then his hand is sort of passively on his shoulder. It's not a typical tie-up position. Again, when it comes to the actual techniques, I think that there's a lot of value here. A few dubious things, but yeah, from the high tie-up, you are going to see a lot of these things executed in different grappling systems. As far as the pros go, there are several sequences in here that I think have a lot of value. We do get to see, again, things like defending against punches and then moving into clinch work and takedowns. It's also very well organized. Things build off of each other. Again, we got stance and footwork, the fundamentals of movement before getting into trapping. Then after the trapping, we get into moving from the trapping into the grappling sequences. So, 9 years before the UFC, and really before the skill of MMA was developed outside of, maybe Yori Nakamura's Shuto, we are getting sequences that we would eventually find in, faking a jab to get the guard up and then moving into, clinch work and takedowns and stuff like that. So in some ways that was ahead of its time. As far as the cons go, I gotta say a lot of these sequences really seem reliant on the opponent freezing in place with their arm hanging out. I talked about it when it came to, the defensive section where the guy throws a jab and you catch it and then you turn it into a standing figure four lock. And I've never seen a jab that moved so slowly that you could do that to. But we also see it in the intro section into all these trapping techniques. I really don't think it's going to be that easy or it's going to be all that common to get into that high outside reference point, ignoring the fact that a lot of Jeet Kune Do is based on having a right lead, while many people, trained or untrained, tend to lead with their left side. It's not really all that instinctive to defend by stretching your arm out alongside the other guy's arm. There is such a thing as that. It's a sliding leverage block. You might instinctively get maybe some karate fighters, doing like a down block style for the low reference point. That might work. But just that extended lead reference, I just don't see it happening that much. So because of that, some of these sequences might be okay from an academic standpoint, but I think from a practical standpoint, there's something missing there. I think that they would have to be modified in some way, shape, or form. I think, frankly, there might be too much emphasis on creating, it's referred to as a bridge arm in Kung Fu styles, that arm-to-arm connection in order to begin to execute trapping techniques when, just like clinching with the guy would work instead. Just blasting him in the face and then, snagging a collar tie. You can do that. So, recommendations. I guess I should have said this up front. I'm actually a member of the Jeonfan Jeet Kune Do Grappling Association, which is run by Mr. Hartsell's widow. This would be a study guide going into that particular organization. Pretty good study guide, again, for the art, Jeet Kune Do, even though Jeet Kune Do is not, it is or it isn't a style depending on who you ask. But this can provide, I would say, an academic curriculum for, again, moving from striking into trapping into grappling. I would say for people who are more practically minded, if you cut out the trapping aspect of it, or limited how much trapping was actually involved in this book, then I think a lot of it actually pays off. There's a lot of, tying up when the guy swings a punch at you, and then like, okay, now I've got, what we would call an overhook, and then I can begin to throw my strikes and go for throws and stuff like that. That is something that we actually do see come out of fighting sequences. So from a practical standpoint, whether you are looking at, mixed martial arts, because I think there's a lot of opportunity for that here, or you're looking at just personal self-defense, I think that there are definitely sections of this that you can look at and use for your own game. I would say particularly if you have a background in a boxing-oriented or a standing grappling-oriented system. If you have a background in something like judo or wrestling, maybe you can learn how, like, okay, I can use these strikes to get into a position to execute my throws. If you have a background in boxing or Jeet Kune Do, you know, again, using your striking techniques to position yourself in a way that you can execute throws and takedowns. I will say, from a technical standpoint, the throws and takedowns in here and the follow-ups didn't get nearly as much attention as they would in other books, such as books on judo or catch wrestling. So if you come from a striking background and you want to incorporate some grappling, it's good to have an education, a more thorough education than what this provides, in various grappling systems. But I think the ideas there can be helpful. So that's all I have for this week, guys. This was a viewer request. If you would like to support the channel, please donate to my Ko-fi account. There's going to be a link in the description and on the main About page. And thank you for watching. I'll see you later.